The Dallas County Courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity as Jennifer Mitchell nervously adjusted her blazer while sitting on the wooden bench outside courtroom 305. Her daughter, 8-year-old Sarah, sat beside her, swinging her legs back and forth, her small pink backpack clutched tightly to her chest. The child's brown ponytail was neatly tied with a matching pink ribbon. Jennifer had spent extra time that morning making sure her daughter looked perfect for their court appearance. "Mrs. Mitchell, the judge is ready for you now," announced the court clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. Jennifer took a deep breath, gently squeezed Sarah's hand, and led her daughter into the courtroom. The room was smaller than Jennifer had imagined, nothing like the grand courtrooms she'd seen on television. The wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting created a somber atmosphere. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind the elevated bench, reviewing documents with practiced efficiency. On the other side of the courtroom, Thomas Mitchell, Jennifer's soon-to-be ex-husband, sat with his attorney. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that Jennifer had never seen before, his dark hair perfectly styled, and a confident smile played across his face. The sight of him made Jennifer's stomach knot. She knew that smile all too well. It was the same smile he wore when he was about to deliver one of his perfectly crafted lies. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the proceedings began. Judge Reynolds looked up from her papers, her eyes moving between the two parties before settling on Sarah, who was now sitting quietly beside her mother. "We're here today to review the custody arrangement for Sarah Mitchell," Judge Reynolds stated, her voice clear and authoritative. "Mr. Mitchell has requested modifications to the current arrangement, claiming he should have primary custody. Is that correct?" Thomas's attorney, a sharp-dressed man with a red tie, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. My client has documented evidence of his extensive involvement in his daughter's life and believes it would be in Sarah's best interest to spend more time with him." Jennifer felt her heart rate increase. She knew the truth. Thomas had barely seen Sarah in the past year, constantly canceling their scheduled visits with last-minute excuses, but he was always good at making things look perfect on paper. Thomas took the stand, and his performance was flawless. He spoke with conviction about helping Sarah with her homework every Wednesday evening, attending her soccer games on weekends, and being actively involved in parent-teacher conferences. He described their Sunday morning pancake traditions and how he never missed reading her a bedtime story during his designated visitation days. As Thomas continued his testimony, Jennifer noticed Sarah becoming increasingly restless beside her. The little girl's face had turned red, and her small hands were clenched into fists. Jennifer placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, trying to calm her, but Sarah's agitation only seemed to grow. "I make sure to attend every school event," Thomas was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "Just last week, I was there for her science fair presentation about butterflies. Sarah won first place, and I couldn't have been prouder." That was the moment something inside Sarah snapped. Jennifer felt her daughter's shoulder tense under her hand. Before anyone could react, Sarah had jumped to her feet, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the quiet courtroom. "Daddy is lying." The outburst echoed off the walls, causing everyone in the room to freeze. Judge Reynolds' eyebrows shot up, Thomas's confident smile faltered, and his attorney half rose from his chair, mouth open to object. But Sarah wasn't finished. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady as she continued. "There was no science fair last week. I'd never even done a project about butterflies." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Reynolds leaned forward in her chair, her expression both concerned and intrigued. Thomas's face had lost all color, and his attorney was frantically shuffling through his papers. Jennifer sat stunned, her hand still hovering where Sarah's shoulder had been moments before. She had always taught Sarah to tell the truth, but she never expected her quiet, usually reserved daughter to find her voice in such a dramatic way. As the first part of this custody hearing drew to a close, no one in courtroom 305 could have predicted how Sarah's brave outburst would change everything, not just for her family, but for how the entire county would handle future custody cases involving children's testimony. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Sarah, her stern expression softening as she observed the trembling child. The courtroom remained silent, the air thick with tension after Sarah's unexpected outburst. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Sarah, Judge Reynolds spoke gently. Would you like to tell me more about what you mean? She gestured to a chair near her bench. You can come sit here if you'd like. Jennifer watched anxiously as her daughter walked forward, her pink backpack still clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Sarah's small shoes made soft tapping sounds on the wooden floor. Tap, 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 until she reached the chair. The bailiff helped her get seated, and Sarah's feet dangled several inches above the floor. Now, Sarah, Judge Reynolds continued, her voice remaining gentle but professional, I understand this is difficult, but it's very important that you tell me the truth about everything. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Yes, Your Honor. That's what Mommy always tells me, that telling the truth is the most important thing. Your father just told us about helping you with homework and attending your school events. Can you tell me about that? Sarah's lower lip trembled, but her voice came out clear and strong. Daddy hasn't helped me with homework since last year when he still lived with us. He promised to come to my real science fair 3 months ago. It was about the solar system, not butterflies, but he didn't show up. Thomas attempted to interject, Your Honor, she's just confused about the dates. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Reynolds cut him off sharply. You've had your time to speak. Right now, I'm listening to your daughter. Sarah continued, gaining confidence with each word. Daddy always says he's coming to see me on weekends. Then he calls at the last minute and says he's too busy. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small diary with unicorns on the cover. I write down every time he cancels. Mommy doesn't know I do this. I wanted to remember. The judge accepted the diary when Sarah offered it, carefully turning the pages. Each entry was written in a child's messy handwriting, with dates and brief notes. Daddy canceled again. Daddy said he had to work. Daddy went to Amanda's kids' party instead. Jennifer felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had no idea Sarah had been keeping track. Her daughter, who seemed so quiet and accepting each time Thomas disappointed her, had been documenting everything. Thomas's attorney stood up, straightening his tie nervously. Your Honor, while this is touching, we have documented evidence of my client's involvement. The documents you provided, Judge Reynolds interrupted, show Mr. Mitchell's scheduled visitation times. They don't prove these visits actually occurred. She turned back to Sarah. Sweetheart, can you tell me about the last time you spent time with your father? Sarah's face scrunched up in concentration. It was at Christmas. He came for 1 hour to give me presents, but he was looking at his phone the whole time. Then he said he had to go because Amanda was waiting. Who is Amanda? The judge asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Daddy's girlfriend, Sarah replied softly. She has 2 kids, and Daddy takes them to the zoo and to movies. I see the pictures on his Facebook. He never takes me anymore. The courtroom fell silent again. Jennifer could see Thomas slumping in his chair, the weight of his daughter's words crushing his carefully constructed facade. His attorney was frantically writing notes, likely trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Judge Reynolds closed Sarah's diary and handed it back to her with care. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth, Sarah. I know it wasn't easy. She then turned to address the attorneys. In light of this testimony, I believe we need to take a short recess. When we return, I'd like to hear from Mrs. Mitchell, and then Mr. Mitchell will have an opportunity to address these statements. As the bailiff called for a 15-minute recess, Sarah returned to her mother's side. Jennifer wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, amazed at the strength this small child had shown. Across the room, Thomas sat with his head in his hands, his perfect image crumbling around him, as the truth he had tried so hard to hide was finally exposed through the honest words of his daughter. After the 15-minute recess, the atmosphere in courtroom 305 had shifted dramatically. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background as everyone retook their seats. Jennifer noticed that Thomas had loosened his tie, and his perfectly styled hair was now slightly disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly during the break. Judge Reynolds called the court back to session, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Mitchell, please take the stand. Jennifer squeezed Sarah's hand before walking to the witness box. After being sworn in, she sat down, smoothing her skirt nervously. Her attorney, Miss Thompson, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a determined expression, approached. Mrs. Mitchell, could you tell the court about the visitation schedule that was established when you and Mr. Mitchell initially separated? Jennifer took a deep breath and began speaking. Thomas was supposed to have Sarah every other weekend, from Friday evening to Sunday evening. He was also supposed to have dinner with her every Wednesday night. She paused, collecting her thoughts. At first, he kept to the schedule, but about 8 months ago, things started to change. Could you elaborate on these changes? Miss Thompson asked. Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I started keeping all of our text messages. At first, the cancellations were occasional. He claimed to have an important meeting or be feeling under the weather, but they became more and more frequent. The judge nodded for Jennifer to continue. Then I started seeing social media posts of him at restaurants, parties, or on trips during times he was supposed to be with Sarah. He would tell us he was sick or working. Then pictures would appear of him at the beach with Amanda and her children or at amusement parks. Thomas's attorney stood up to object, but Judge Reynolds waved him down. I'll allow it. These posts are relevant to establishing Mr. Mitchell's pattern of behavior. Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger. Sarah would sit by the window every Wednesday night, waiting for a father who rarely showed up. She would pack her weekend bag every other Friday, only to end up unpacking it when Thomas called with another excuse. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Mitchell, did you ever try to address these issues with Mr. Mitchell directly? Yes, Your Honor. I sent numerous emails and text messages trying to discuss the situation. I even suggested family counseling. Jennifer's voice cracked slightly. His responses became increasingly hostile. He accused me of trying to control his life and threatened to take me back to court, which is why we're here today. Sarah, still sitting in the gallery, hugged her backpack tighter as she listened to her mother speak. The little girl's diary had been marked as evidence, its unicorn cover now resting on the judge's bench alongside the other documents. Miss Thompson approached with a stack of printed papers. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these text message exchanges, email communications, and social media screenshots as evidence. They clearly show a pattern of Mr. Mitchell prioritizing his new relationship over his responsibilities to his daughter. Judge Reynolds accepted the documents, taking a moment to review them. The courtroom remained silent except for the sound of papers being turned and the occasional clearing of throats. Thomas's attorney whispered something to his client, who shook his head vigorously in response. The confident man from earlier that morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate and cornered. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Reynolds spoke again. What are you seeking from these proceedings? Jennifer straightened her shoulders. I'm not trying to keep Sarah from her father, Your Honor. I just want Thomas to be held accountable for the promises he makes to our daughter. She deserves a father who shows up, who makes her a priority, who doesn't treat her like an inconvenient obligation. The judge nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her legal pad. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. You may step down. She then turned her attention to Thomas and his attorney. Mr. Mitchell, are you prepared to respond to these statements and the evidence presented? Thomas tugged at his collar, his face pale and drawn. His attorney stood, adjusting his tie nervously. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, we request a brief recess to confer with our client. The judge checked her watch. You have 10 minutes, Counselor. When we resume, I expect Mr. Mitchell to address these serious allegations directly and honestly. As the bailiff called another recess, Sarah caught her father's eye across the courtroom. For the first time that day, Thomas couldn't maintain eye contact with his daughter, quickly looking away as the weight of his choices became impossible to ignore. When court resumed after the 10-minute recess, Thomas Mitchell took the stand. His earlier polished appearance had completely crumbled. His suit jacket was now draped over his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and a light sheen of sweat covered his forehead. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Reynolds began, her voice stern but measured. You've heard the testimony from both your daughter and ex-wife. You've seen the evidence presented. What do you have to say in response? Thomas cleared his throat several times before speaking. His voice, once confident and smooth, now trembled slightly. Your Honor, I don't know where to begin. The truth would be an excellent starting point, the judge replied, glancing briefly at Sarah, who sat watching her father intently. When Jennifer and I separated, Thomas began. I had every intention of being the perfect weekend dad. I told myself I'd make up for not being there every day by making our time together special. He paused, swallowing hard. But then I met Amanda. The courtroom remained silent as Thomas continued. Amanda has 2 kids, as Sarah mentioned. They're a little older than Sarah, 11 and 13. At first, I tried to balance everything. I thought I could make it work, be there for everyone. And what changed? Judge Reynolds prompted. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, further disheveling it. It was easier with Amanda's kids. They were older, more independent. They didn't need as much attention. And honestly, he hesitated, glancing at Sarah before looking down at his hands. They didn't look at me with the same expectations Sarah did. They didn't count on me the way she did. Jennifer instinctively reached for Sarah's hand as they listened to Thomas's confession. When Sarah looks at me, Thomas's voice cracked. She sees her daddy, the man who used to read her bedtime stories and check for monsters under the bed. But with Amanda's kids, I could just be the fun guy who showed up with presents and took them places. No real responsibility. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, are you saying you chose to prioritize your girlfriend's children over your own daughter because it was easier? When you put it that way, Your Honor. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Yes, I suppose I did, and then when I started missing visits with Sarah, it became harder to face her. Each time I canceled, I felt more guilty, so I made more excuses, which led to more guilt. And the lies you told this court earlier today, the judge pressed. I was trying to save face, Thomas admitted, his shoulders slumping. I wanted to believe I was still the father Sarah deserved. I convinced myself that my intentions counted for something, but when she stood up and called me out, he looked directly at Sarah for the first time since his testimony began. When my 8-year-old daughter had the courage to tell the truth that I couldn't. Tears began rolling down Thomas's cheeks. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. You deserve better than this, better than me. Sarah sat very still, her small face a mixture of emotions, hurt, confusion, and something that looked like relief at finally hearing her father acknowledge the truth. Judge Reynolds picked up Sarah's unicorn diary from her bench. Mr. Mitchell, I'd like you to look at this diary. Your daughter, who you claimed to spend so much time with, felt the need to document every time you let her down, every broken promise, every canceled visit, every time you chose someone else's children over her. Do you understand the impact this has had on her? Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. I do now, Your Honor. I do now. And what would you like to see happen moving forward? The judge asked. I don't deserve the custody arrangement I was asking for, Thomas replied. I haven't earned that right. What I want now, what I need, is a chance to rebuild my relationship with my daughter. The right way this time. No more lies, no more excuses. Judge Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her legal pad. Mr. Mitchell, you may step down. Before I make my ruling, however, there's one more person I need to hear from. She turned her attention to Sarah once again. Sarah, would you be willing to tell me what you want to happen? All eyes in the courtroom turned to the little girl with the pink backpack, waiting to hear what she would say about her father's confession and their future together. Sarah walked slowly to the front of the courtroom for the second time that day. This time, she seemed different, less afraid, but more thoughtful. Judge Reynolds had arranged for a special cushion to be placed on the chair so Sarah could sit higher and more comfortably. Sarah, the judge began gently, you've heard everything your father just said. I know this is a lot for someone your age to handle, but I'd like to know how you're feeling and what you want. Sarah glanced at her unicorn diary that still sat on the judge's bench. Her voice was quiet but clear when she spoke. I used to think it was my fault. What do you mean by that, sweetheart? Judge Reynolds asked. When Daddy started canceling our time together, I thought maybe I did something wrong. Sarah's fingers played with the zipper of her backpack. I tried to be extra good. I got all A's in school. I even learned to make my own breakfast so I wouldn't be too much trouble when I visited. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back tears. Even Thomas seemed to physically flinch at his daughter's words. But then, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I saw the pictures of Daddy with Amanda's kids. He took them to Disney World during my birthday weekend. He said he had to work, but he was riding roller coasters with them. She pulled something else from her backpack, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a printed Facebook photo. The bailiff took the photo and handed it to Judge Reynolds. It showed Thomas, Amanda, and her 2 children posing with Mickey Mouse, the date stamp clearly visible. "That was the day I started writing in my diary," Sarah explained. "Mommy always says that writing things down helps you understand them better." And she was right. When I wrote everything down, I started to see that it wasn't my fault. It was Daddy's choices. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word from the 8-year-old girl. "Do you still want to spend time with your father?" Judge Reynolds asked carefully. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, but," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "I don't want him to promise things anymore. It hurts more when he promises and doesn't come than when he just says no from the beginning." Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the truth of his daughter's words hitting him hard. "And what about Amanda's children?" the judge prompted. "I don't hate them," Sarah said, surprising everyone with her maturity. "Sometimes I see them in Daddy's pictures, and they look happy. I just wish," she trailed off. "What do you wish, Sarah?" "I wish Daddy knew that I could be fun too. I can ride roller coasters and go to the zoo. I'm not just homework and responsibility." Sarah's voice wavered slightly. "I'm still his daughter, even if he has a new family now." Judge Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah, what would make you feel safe and happy in spending time with your father going forward?" Sarah sat up straighter. "I want him to come to my real things, not just say he did. Like my actual science fair next month, and my soccer games. But," she looked directly at her father, "only if he really wants to. Not because a judge says he has to." Thomas started to speak, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand, silencing him. "And," Sarah continued, "I want him to talk to me like he talks to Amanda's kids. Not just asking about school and grades, but about what makes me happy and scared and excited." Judge Reynolds smiled gently. "Those sound like very reasonable requests, Sarah. Is there anything else you'd like to say?" Sarah shook her head, then paused. "Just one thing." She turned to look at her father again. "Daddy, I still love you. Even when you lie, even when you don't come, I just want you to love me enough to show up." The simplicity and honesty of her words seemed to echo through the courtroom. Jennifer was openly crying now, and Thomas had his head bowed, shoulders shaking slightly. Judge Reynolds removed her glasses and wiped her eyes, something she hadn't done in court for many years. "Thank you, Sarah," the judge said softly. "You've been very brave and very honest today. You may return to your seat now. I believe I have everything I need to make my decision." Judge Reynolds took several moments to review her notes, the silence in the courtroom thick with anticipation. She glanced at Sarah's unicorn diary one last time before straightening in her chair and addressing the court. "Before I deliver my ruling," she began, her voice firm but compassionate, "I want to make something very clear. This court has seen many custody battles, but rarely have we witnessed such raw honesty from a child, or such a clear example of how parental actions impact young lives." She turned her attention to Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter has shown more maturity today than you have demonstrated in the past year. While you came to this court seeking increased custody rights, what you've received instead is a powerful wake-up call." Thomas nodded, no longer attempting to maintain any pretense of composure. His attorney sat beside him, having abandoned any attempt to salvage their original custody modification request. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, I am making the following ruling," Judge Reynolds continued, lifting her official document. "Primary physical custody will remain with Mrs. Mitchell. However, this is not the end of the matter." The judge turned a page in her documents. "Mr. Mitchell, you will have the opportunity to rebuild your relationship with your daughter, but it will be on a structured basis that prioritizes Sarah's emotional well-being." She outlined the new arrangements. "First, you will begin attending weekly counseling sessions, both individual sessions and father-daughter sessions with Sarah. These sessions are mandatory and will be conducted by Dr. Maria Rodriguez, who specializes in repairing parent-child relationships." Thomas wrote down the information as the judge continued. "Second, your visitation rights will be restructured. Instead of full weekends that may be canceled at the last minute, you will begin with shorter, more manageable commitments. You will have Wednesday afternoon visits from 3:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., during which you must be fully present. No phone calls, no work interruptions, and no including other family members without prior agreement from all parties. Sarah sat up straighter, her expression showing a mix of hope and uncertainty. Third, Judge Reynolds continued, you will be required to provide written notice at least 48 hours in advance if you need to cancel any visit, along with a valid reason. Each cancellation will be logged with the court, and excessive cancellations will result in a mandatory court review. Jennifer's attorney nodded approvingly at these conditions. Fourth, you will maintain a detailed visitation journal, documenting your activities and interactions with Sarah. This journal will be reviewed during your counseling sessions and may be requested by the court at any time. The judge paused, making sure Thomas understood the seriousness of these requirements. After 3 months of consistent participation in these activities, we will reassess the situation and consider gradually expanding visitation times, but only if Sarah feels comfortable with such changes. She then addressed both parents. Furthermore, I am ordering the creation of a co-parenting app account where all communications between Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell must be logged. This will provide a clear record of arrangements, cancellations, and any issues that arise. Looking directly at Thomas again, she added, Mr. Mitchell, this court is giving you an opportunity to prove your recent words of remorse through actions rather than promises. Do you understand and accept these conditions? Thomas stood, his voice steady for the first time since his confession. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Sarah, Judge Reynolds turned to the young girl, her voice softening. How do you feel about this arrangement? Sarah hugged her backpack close. I think it's fair, and I like that Daddy has to write things down too, not just me. A small smile crossed the judge's face at Sarah's response. One final thing, she added. I'm requiring all parties to return to this court in 3 months for a progress review. Sarah, you will have the opportunity to tell us how things are going, just as you did today. The judge picked up her gavel. This court will reconvene on May 17th at 9:00 a.m. for the progress review. Until then, these orders are in immediate effect. She struck the gavel, making her ruling official. As the courtroom began to clear, Sarah looked at her father, who was still absorbing the judge's words. For the first time that day, a small smile appeared on her face, not because everything was fixed, but because finally, someone was making her father do what she had been doing all along, keeping track of the truth. 3 months passed quickly, bringing significant changes to the Mitchell family dynamic. On the morning of their scheduled court review, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, carefully reviewing her diary entries from the past 12 weeks. Her mother watched from the counter while preparing breakfast, noticing how her daughter's entries had evolved from simple recordings of disappointments to detailed accounts of new experiences. Sarah, honey, are you ready to head to the courthouse? Jennifer asked, placing a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her daughter. Sarah nodded, closing her unicorn diary, now filled with not just the old painful memories, but new, hopeful ones too. Mom, do you think Daddy will be there on time today? Well, Jennifer smiled. He hasn't been late to a Wednesday visit in 11 weeks now, has he? The transformation in Thomas's behavior over the past 3 months had been remarkable. Following Judge Reynolds' strict orders, he had attended every scheduled counseling session with Dr. Rodriguez. The father-daughter sessions, though initially awkward and filled with long silences, had gradually become something both Sarah and Thomas looked forward to. When they arrived at the courthouse, Thomas was already there, sitting on the same bench where Jennifer and Sarah had waited 3 months earlier. He stood up as they approached, wearing a simpler suit than last time, but carrying himself with a new kind of confidence, not the artificial kind he'd shown before, but something more genuine. Good morning, Sarah, he said softly. I brought something for the judge. He held up a thick notebook, his visitation journal, filled with detailed entries about every Wednesday afternoon he'd spent with his daughter. Inside courtroom 305, Judge Reynolds reviewed both Sarah's diary and Thomas's journal with careful attention. The co-parenting app logs showed consistent communication between the parents, with only one canceled visit due to a documented case of flu, supported by a doctor's note. Sarah, Judge Reynolds began, would you like to tell me how these past 3 months have been? Sarah walked to the front with more confidence than before. It's been different, Your Honor. Good different. She pulled out a sheet of paper from her backpack. I made a list of all the new things Daddy and I did together. The judge nodded encouragingly, and Sarah continued. We went to the library every other Wednesday, and Daddy helped me find books about space because I'm still interested in that after my science fair. He came to my science fair too, just like he promised, and stayed the whole time. Thomas sat quietly, listening to his daughter speak. Sometimes we just did homework or had dinner, but Daddy wasn't on his phone anymore. He asked me questions about my friends and my favorite subjects. Last week, we made a solar system model together for my room. Sarah paused, then added, and he hasn't missed any visits except when he was really sick, and he called me that day to say sorry. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been invited to provide her professional assessment, stood up next. Your Honor, I've observed significant progress in both Mr. Mitchell's understanding of his parental responsibilities and in Sarah's ability to trust her father again. Their communication has improved dramatically, and Sarah shows noticeably less anxiety about their scheduled time together. Judge Reynolds turned to Thomas. Mr. Mitchell, what have you learned from these past 3 months? Thomas stood, holding his journal. Your Honor, I've learned that being a father isn't about grand gestures or perfect Facebook photos. It's about showing up, consistently, even for the small moments. Through these weekly visits, I've really gotten to know my daughter again, not just as an obligation, but as the amazing person she is. He looked at Sarah. I've learned that 4 hours of genuine attention and care means more than a whole weekend of distracted time. And I've learned that trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through consistent actions, not promises. Judge Reynolds nodded approvingly. Given the positive reports from all parties, I'm prepared to modify the visitation schedule slightly. Mr. Mitchell, you will maintain your Wednesday visits, and we'll add Saturday afternoons, from 1:00 p.m. to 6:00 p.m., for the next 3 months. We'll continue to monitor progress and adjust accordingly. She looked at Sarah. Is this arrangement acceptable to you, Sarah? Sarah smiled, a real, full smile that reached her eyes. Yes, Your Honor. I think Daddy's getting better at keeping his promises. I'm getting better at believing him again. As the judge finalized the new arrangement, both Sarah's unicorn diary and Thomas's visitation journal sat on the bench, 2 different perspectives of the same journey toward healing, written one honest entry at a time. 1 year after Sarah's brave courtroom declaration, the Mitchell family gathered once again in courtroom 305. This time, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sarah, now 9 years old, wore a bright yellow dress and carried her well-worn unicorn diary, its pages filled with a year's worth of memories, most of them happy ones. Judge Reynolds smiled as she reviewed the final progress reports. The transformation she had witnessed over the past year had become one of her most memorable cases, often cited as an example of successful family court intervention. Before we begin our final review, Judge Reynolds announced, I'd like to hear from Sarah one last time. Sarah approached the bench confidently, no longer needing the special cushion to sit higher in the chair. Your Honor, I brought something to show you. She opened her diary to a carefully marked page. This is my list of Daddy's perfect moments, the times when I knew things were really changing. The judge leaned forward with interest as Sarah read from her list. Number 1, when Daddy came to my school play, even though it was not his scheduled day, and he brought flowers but didn't take any pictures for social media. He just watched me and smiled. Thomas sat quietly, tears forming in his eyes as his daughter continued. Number 2, when I got sick during his Saturday visit, and instead of calling Mom to pick me up, he took care of me and read my favorite book 6 times in a row. Dr. Rodriguez, present for this final review, nodded approvingly as she took notes. Number 3, when he helped me make a special birthday card for Mom and didn't say anything bad about her new boyfriend. He just helped me pick the right colors and wrote the spelling words I didn't know. Jennifer wiped away tears, remembering that moment and how much it had meant to all of them. But the biggest moment, Sarah continued, her voice strong and clear, was last month when Amanda's kids had their big school concert. It was the same night as my soccer championship, and Daddy chose to come to my game. He didn't even hesitate or try to do both. He just said, I'll be there, Sarah, and he was. Judge Reynolds reviewed the year's documentation. Thomas's consistently maintained visitation journal, the co-parenting app logs showing respectful communication between Jennifer and Thomas, and Dr. Rodriguez's detailed reports of the family's progress. Mr. Mitchell, The judge addressed Thomas. Would you like to share your thoughts on this past year? Thomas stood, looking more at peace than he had in any previous hearing. Your Honor, when I first came to this court, I thought being a good father meant having the right paperwork and saying the right things. My daughter taught me that it's about showing up, being present, and making her feel valued. He turned to face Sarah. I learned that every small moment matters, helping with homework, listening to her stories about school, or just sitting together eating ice cream. These moments build trust, one day at a time. Judge Reynolds nodded, then delivered her final ruling. Based on the remarkable progress shown by all parties, I'm pleased to approve the new custody arrangement as agreed upon by both parents. Mr. Mitchell will continue his Wednesday and Saturday visits, with the addition of one overnight stay every other weekend. She looked directly at Sarah. This arrangement can be adjusted as needed, Sarah. Your voice will always matter in these decisions. Sarah beamed. Thank you, Your Honor. Can I ask one question? Of course. Can I still keep writing in my diary, even though things are better now? Judge Reynolds smiled warmly. Sarah, I think that's an excellent idea. Sometimes we need to record the good memories just as much as the difficult ones. As the final hearing concluded, Sarah stood between her parents, not torn between them as she had been a year ago, but secure in the knowledge that both of them were truly there for her. Her unicorn diary, once a record of broken promises, had become a testament to healing and growth. Outside the courthouse, Thomas knelt down to Sarah's level. Ice cream to celebrate. Yes, Sarah paused, then added with a grin, but only if you help me write about it in my diary after. Jennifer watched as father and daughter walked hand in hand toward the ice cream shop, realizing that sometimes the biggest changes come not from grand gestures or legal declarations, but from small, consistent acts of love and the courage of a child who dared to speak the truth. The Unicorn Diary would continue its journey, now chronicling the story of a father and daughter who learned to rebuild their relationship, one honest entry at a time.